It is the 6th of June, 1944. Somewhere on a stretch of Norman coastline the planners have codenamed Gold Beach. The tide is coming in fast, and the air smells of cordite and diesel and the sea. A squat, ungainly tank grinds up over the shingle, its turret stubby and strange, lacking the long, graceful barrel of a Sherman or a Cromwell. Inside, 6 men sit in near darkness, sweating through their overalls, listening to machine gun fire rattle off the hull like hail on a tin roof. Somewhere ahead, hidden behind 1.5 meters of reinforced concrete, a German strongpoint is holding up the entire advance. Conventional tank shells have struck it and simply bounced away, leaving scorch marks but no damage. This vehicle is different. Its turret carries no proper gun at all but a short, fat mortar barrel, and behind it a rack of bombs so large and round that the crews who load them have already given them a nickname that will outlive the war: the Flying Dustbin. The co-driver slides open his hatch. He has perhaps 30 seconds to do what comes next, and every one of those seconds his hands and forearms are exposed to enemy fire. He reaches up, breaks open the stubby barrel like a shotgun, and posts in a bomb the size of a large dustbin lid, packed with high explosive. The turret traverses back round. The gunner sights through a notch designed for a different weapon entirely, because this mortar was built to share the existing mount of the tank's old 6-pounder gun. He fires. There is no crack, no flash of a conventional shell. Instead, there is a heavy, percussive thud, like a door slamming in a distant room, and a dark shape lobs lazily through the air, climbing barely above head height before crashing down onto the bunker's roof. The explosion that follows does not simply scorch the concrete. It cracks it open like an eggshell. This is the petard mortar, mounted on a Churchill tank converted for one purpose alone: smashing fortifications that nothing else in the Allied arsenal could touch. The vehicle that carries it has a deliberately unglamorous designation: AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineer, and for decades after the war it would slip out of public memory almost entirely, overshadowed by the Spitfires and the Shermans and the more photogenic machines of the conflict. Yet, on the beaches of Normandy, and in the months of brutal fighting that followed, this strange, slow, dustbin-throwing tank did something that no rifle, no field gun, and no amount of raw infantry courage had managed to do reliably before it. It made the German bunker, the single most feared obstacle on the Atlantic coast, obsolete almost overnight. To understand why the British Army needed such a peculiar weapon, and why its development was treated as one of the most urgent engineering problems of the war, you first have to understand a catastrophe that very nearly buried the idea before it was born. That catastrophe has a name, and it is Dieppe. On August 19, 1942, a force of more than 6,000 men, the overwhelming majority of them Canadian, stormed ashore at the French port in an operation intended to test whether the Allies could seize a defended harbor by direct assault. The Churchill tanks involved did not get stuck on the beach itself. Many made it off only to be blocked by tank obstacles, and because the engineers tasked with clearing those obstacles were pinned down, the tanks could not get through. The men whose job it was to blast a path for the armor, the Royal Canadian Engineers, paid a horrifying price for that failure. Of the roughly 314 sappers who landed that morning, 186 were killed or wounded, a casualty rate that some other accounts of the same engineer companies put as high as 90%, the worst suffered by any unit on the beach that day. Without specialized vehicles capable of breaching concrete and clearing obstacles from a position of armored safety, men were being asked to do that job standing upright in the open, under fire, with explosive charges in their hands. The result, by the end of that single morning, was that of the roughly 6,000 soldiers who had landed, more than 3,600 were killed, wounded, or captured, and every one of the 27 tanks put ashore was lost. Dieppe was a disaster by almost any measure, but it was an instructive one, and the lesson the planners drew from it was brutally simple. You could not keep sending engineers onto fortified beaches with nothing but satchel charges and bravery. and you could not expect ordinary tank guns to crack open the kind of reinforced concrete the Germans were now pouring along the length of the Atlantic coast. The problem facing British military planners by 1943 was a question of raw physics as much as tactics. A standard 6-pounder shell, fired from a Churchill or a Sherman, carried perhaps 2 kilograms of explosive filling inside an armor-piercing casing designed to punch through steel, not crumble masonry. Against a German bunker with walls a meter or more thick, reinforced with steel bar and built to a standard the Wehrmacht had been refining since the Atlantic Wall construction program began in earnest, such a shell did almost nothing beyond chip the surface and announce your position. What was needed was not a weapon that could pierce armor at all. It was a weapon that could deliver an enormous quantity of high explosive directly against a fixed structure at extremely close range from a vehicle armored enough to survive getting that close in the first place. No gun in the British inventory had ever been designed to do precisely that, because no army had ever before needed to smash its way, methodically and at point-blank range, through a continuous chain of fortified positions stretching the length of an entire continent's coastline. The challenge, in short, was to build a battering ram that could also explode. The men who solved this problem worked fittingly for the Department of Tank Design, in close cooperation with engineers experimenting under Major General Sir Percy Hobart, the officer who would lend his name to the entire family of strange specialized vehicles that emerged from this period, popularly known to the troops as Hobart's Funnies. Trials of a new vehicle began throughout 1943, built around the existing Churchill tank, which proved ideal thanks to its generous internal space for demolition stores and its distinctive side-exit doors, allowing engineers to leave and re-enter the vehicle under armored protection while laying charges. The weapon they settled on was not a gun in any conventional sense, but a spigot mortar, a design that dispensed with a long rifled barrel altogether. Instead of being fired down a tube by expanding gas in the usual way, the bomb itself contained a hollow tail into which a steel rod, the spigot, was inserted. Engineers who have since measured surviving examples found the loading trough to be some 660 millimeters long with an internal diameter of around 241 millimeters, while the spigot rod itself ran to roughly 317 millimeters in length and was 29 millimeters across. A slim rod driving an enormous bomb. The name given to the weapon was, appropriately, petard, a 16th-century French term for a bomb designed specifically to breach fortifications, and the choice of name was no accident. This was a weapon with a single, narrow purpose. The projectile itself, officially the No. 1 demolition bomb, was the part that earned the affectionate, slightly absurd nickname that has stuck to this weapon ever since. It weighed around 40 pounds, roughly 18 kilograms, of which some 28 pounds was high explosive filling, all packed into a stubby, round-nosed casing that looked, to the soldiers who had to load and fire it, uncannily like an upturned dustbin sailing through the air. Picture, for scale, something close to the weight of a fully loaded suitcase, fired not from a rifle but lobbed almost gently from a short, fat barrel, climbing in a shallow arc no higher than a man's head before crashing down on its target. The explosive charge alone amounted to roughly 17.8 kilograms of TNT, more than enough, concentrated against a single point of impact, to demolish most fortified structures the vehicle would encounter. The weapon's range was never its strength. Its effective range was only around 80 yards, some 73 meters, with a maximum of around 210 meters, meaning the crew had to drive their tank to almost suicidal proximity before they could even think about firing. That close range was, in its own way, the entire point. The petard was never meant to be an artillery piece. It was meant to be a battering ram with a fuse. Engineering such a weapon for mass production required compromises, and the cleverest of them concerned how the thing was actually mounted. Rather than design an entirely new turret, the designers built the petard to fit the existing mantlet used by either the 6-pounder or 75-millimeter gun already in service on Churchill tanks, which dramatically simplified production because no structural alterations to the turret itself were required. The drawback, and it was a serious one, was the loading procedure. The loader's hands had to be fully exposed during reloading, which was far from ideal in combat. To reload, the turret would first be traversed so that the petard sat directly over the bow gunner's position, at which point that crewman would slide open a hatch that had replaced the standard two-part Churchill hatch and reach up to physically break the barrel open, much like a giant shotgun, before posting in a fresh bomb. Manufacturing these conversions fell to British workshops adapting existing Churchill Mark III and Mark IV hulls, with the spigot mortar itself developed under the Department of Tank Design's direction, and full production beginning in 1944, with completed vehicles assigned to 3 regiments of the Royal Engineers, forming the newly raised 1st Assault Brigade, itself part of Hobart's 79th Armored Division. Exact production figures from this period remain somewhat patchy in the surviving paperwork, scattered as they are across regimental records and War Office files. But what is clear is that by D-Day, sufficient numbers existed to equip the specialized assault squadrons that would land in the very first waves, precisely the role that ordinary engineers, lacking armor, had been forced into at Dieppe with such terrible cost. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The petard's first major test came on the beaches of Normandy itself, where AVREs landed alongside the assault infantry specifically to deal with the concrete strongpoints the Germans had spent 4 years building. Eyewitness accounts from German defenders, where they survive, give some sense of just how disorienting the weapon's effect could be from the receiving end. One German corporal of the 325th Infantry Division, recalling the fighting around a coastal bunker, described how repeated, inaccurate British tank fire still produced explosions enormous enough to blind his position with smoke and dust, forcing his own machine gun crew to stop firing simply to let the air clear and conserve ammunition. He went on to describe a moment that has become one of the more vivid documented encounters of the entire campaign, watching a strange, short-barreled Churchill simply push its way past a burning Sherman, drive directly through the flames, and continue advancing on his position without slowing, even as his own anti-tank gun's rounds deflected harmlessly off its turret front. That single passage, written from inside a German strongpoint under fire, captures something the official reports cannot quite manage: the simple psychological shock of facing a vehicle that seemed indifferent to the weapons meant to stop it. Beyond Normandy, AVREs went on to serve throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe, and the wider Wikipedia record of the type notes that the petard's demolition capability proved genuinely valuable to the Allied advance, and that the sheer visual and psychological impact of seeing the weapon in action caused a number of defending positions to abandon their posts rather than wait to be hit by one. The vehicles were frequently used in close partnership with another of Hobart's funnies, the Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tank, in a grim but effective tactical pairing. The AVRE would crack open a bunker's defenses with the petard, allowing the flamethrower tank to follow up by soaking the exposed interior with burning fuel, usually forcing the occupants to surrender rather than be burned alive. Precise figures for exactly how many bunkers were destroyed by petard fire specifically, as opposed to combined arms action more generally, are not consistently recorded in surviving regimental diaries, and historians researching the type today still rely heavily on photographs, museum records, and scattered individual accounts rather than any single comprehensive operational ledger. What is documented with confidence is the weapon's presence at the very front of the assault on some of the most heavily defended sections of the invasion beaches, doing precisely the job it had been designed to do. It is worth pausing to ask how this peculiar British solution compared with what other nations were attempting at the same time, because the contrast is instructive. The Germans themselves fielded a vaguely comparable concept rather late in the war, the Sturmtiger, a colossal vehicle built on a Tiger tank chassis and armed with a 380mm rocket mortar adapted from a naval depth charge launcher. It was, on paper, a far more powerful weapon, throwing a projectile vastly heavier than the petard's 40-pound dustbin. In practice, only a handful were ever built, somewhere in the region of a few dozen, and the vehicle proved so heavy, slow, and mechanically troublesome that it had negligible influence on any battle it took part in. The American equivalent attempt, by contrast, leaned less towards a single specialized weapon and more towards improvised solutions, such as the hedgerow-cutting rhino tanks devised by ordinary G's in Normandy, ingenious in their own way but never purpose-built for cracking fortified concrete in the manner of the petard. Neither the German nor the American approach matched the particular combination the British had achieved. A weapon cheap and simple enough to fit existing tank turrets with minimal modification, built in sufficient numbers to equip entire assault regiments, and reliable enough to be trusted at the very front of an amphibious landing on the most heavily defended coastline in the world. The British were not alone in recognizing the problem of fortified coastal defenses. They were simply the ones who solved it with a design that could actually be mass-produced and put in the first wave. Assessing the AVRE petard's true historical impact requires a certain honesty about what can and cannot be proven. It did not, by itself, win the Normandy campaign, and no honest historian would claim otherwise. What it did do was remove one of the single greatest sources of Allied casualties from the equation that had haunted planners since Dieppe: the need to send unarmored men against concrete with nothing but explosive charges and courage. The psychological dimension, the effect on German defenders of watching this strange dustbin-throwing tank advance on their position seemingly unstoppable, is harder to quantify than a casualty figure. But the surviving German accounts, however fragmentary, consistently describe a weapon that unsettled defenders disproportionately to the area of concrete it actually destroyed. The petard mortar's broader legacy continued well past 1945. The basic concept of a short-range demolition gun mounted on an armored chassis evolved into the post-war 165mm demolition gun fitted to later Centurion and Chieftain AVREs, vehicles that themselves went on to see active service as late as Operation Granby in the Gulf War of the early 1990s. A handful of original Churchill AVRE petard vehicles survive today in museum collections, including at the Tank Museum in Bovington, where visitors can still see the strange, stubby mortar that replaced a perfectly ordinary tank gun, and at smaller private collections such as Cobbiton in North Devon, where the actual mechanical dimensions of the weapon, the spigot rod, the loading trough, the breech mechanism, have been carefully measured and preserved by enthusiasts decades after the war that produced them. Return, for a moment, to that beach, to that single tank grinding forward through smoke with its strange, stubby turret and its rack of dustbin-shaped bombs. It did not look like a weapon that should have worked. It had no proper gun barrel, no elegant ballistics, no impressive range. Its crew had to expose bare hands to enemy fire every time they wanted to reload it, and its accuracy depended on driving close enough to a fortified enemy position that any other tank would have called the maneuver suicidal. And yet it worked, again and again, on beach after beach, because it had been built to solve one specific problem rather than a dozen general ones. It existed because at Dieppe, in 1942, the British Army had learned at appalling cost what happens when you send brave men against thick concrete with nothing but courage and a few pounds of plastic explosive. It existed because somebody in a drawing office understood that the answer was not a better gun, but an entirely different kind of weapon altogether, one that traded range and elegance for sheer, brutal, close-range demolition power. What the petard achieved, in the end, was deceptively simple. It turned the single greatest defensive advantage the German army possessed along the whole of the Atlantic coast, the bunker, into a target that could be cracked open in seconds rather than besieged for hours. It did this not through some revolutionary new science, but through a piece of unglamorous practical engineering, a fat spigot rod, a 40-pound bomb shaped like household rubbish, and a turret stolen wholesale from an existing tank design to save precious months of production time. No film has ever been made about it. No famous photograph captures its moment of triumph the way the raising of a flag or the fall of a city does. It remains, for most people, an utterly forgotten footnote in a war remembered for Spitfires and Enigma machines and the beaches themselves. But ask the German defenders who watched a flying dustbin sail through the smoke towards their position, and you will find a different verdict. Ask the engineers who, 2 years after Dieppe, finally had a vehicle that could do the job that had once cost them 90% casualties in a single morning. The petard mortar did not win the war alone, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. But it solved, with brutal and unglamorous efficiency, a problem that had seemed almost impossible only 2 years earlier. How do you crack open a fortress without dying in the attempt? The bunkers that had once seemed permanent, immovable, the very embodiment of German engineering confidence, were rendered obsolete not by a bigger gun, but by a strange, slow, dustbin-throwing tank that nobody back home had ever heard of, and that most people, even now, still have not.